Welcome to the deep dive. You've brought us quite a stack of sources today, detailing what looks like a really explosive, maybe consequential, diplomatic move in the Middle East. We're talking about the Trump-Netanyahu 20-point Gaza peace plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, this thing landed like an ultimatum, didn't it? September 29, 2025. President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, they unveil this huge U.S.-backed roadmap. And the goal, not just ending the war in Gaza, but basically dictating its entire future governance. Historic is what they called it.
Instantly called historic by them, yes.
Yeah.
And, well, instantly condemned by others.
Right. Okay, so let's try and unpack this for you. Our mission here is to cut through all that noise. We really need to look at the core points, zero in on those, maximalist demands, like kicking Hamas out completely. And we got to scrutinize the flaws, the contradictions inside it, politically speaking, and most importantly, explore what happens next. Because it all seems to hinge on this one decision, Hamas saying yes or Hamas saying no. The consequences look huge either way.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating, I think, is that the timing and the whole geopolitical setup around it. This plan, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It feels quite deliberate. It seems to blend that, security first maximalist approach from Trump's 2020 deal of the century. But then it grafts on some bits about stabilization, reconstruction, maybe borrowing from things like the Saudi-French New York Declaration we saw earlier.
So bit of old, a bit of new.
Kind of. But the really defining thing, the absolute core sticking point that makes this plan different, is hammering home the explicit, non-negotiable exclusion of Hamas. No role for them, ever. And then there's this new structure, this powerful international oversight body, the Board of Peace, chaired by Trump himself. That's quite something.
Trump chairing it personally, wow.
Yes. And the announcement timing is key, too. It came right amid this intensifying fighting, Israel moving closer to Gaza City, and crucially, right after several major countries actually recognized Palestinian statehood at the UN.
So it feels like a power play, seizing the narrative.
It looks very much like high-stakes geopolitical maneuvering. Less pure diplomacy, perhaps, and more about controlling the agenda at a really critical moment.
Okay, let's dive straight into the mechanics then. This 20-point plan. Starting with the immediate stuff. It's framed as this, ambitious bid to end the conflict once and for all. But the first steps are always de-escalation, hostages.
Absolutely. And those initial steps, they're aggressive. The timeline is tight. The demands are absolute. Point one is about stopping the fighting. An immediate halt to everything. Airstrikes, ground operations, rocket fire. It has to happen the moment the deal is agreed upon.
Immediate and verified cessation before anything else happens.
Exactly. That's the trigger.
And then the hostages. Always the most agonizing part.
Right.
The plan sets out deadlines, exchange ratios. How specific?
Extremely specific. And the timeline, well, almost every source we looked at, apart from the authors, flags it as deeply impractical. Hamas is required to release all remaining hostages. The estimate is around 48, though maybe only 20 are believed alive within just 72 hours of signing.
72 hours. That's incredibly fast.
It's immense pressure, likely intended to force a really quick, decisive move from Hamas, put them on the spot immediately.
And in return, Israel commits to releasing prisoners. That's always the most complex part of these deals politically.
It's a huge number, reflecting how critical those remaining hostages are. Israel agrees to release 250 Palestinians serving life sentences for security offenses, plus another 1,700 Gazans detained since October 2023.
1,700.
Yes. And critically, the plan specifically says all women and children detained during that period must be released. That's an important humanitarian piece built in.
Okay, that's a major trade-off. But there was also something about the deceased. Exchanging remains. That struck me as particularly complex.
It is, and that specific detail, it just underscores the sheer complexity and the emotional weight here. The agreement sets a ratio. For every Israeli hostage's body returned, Israel will return the remains of 15 deceased Palestinians.
15 to 1.
Yes. It's not just logistics. It's about closure, about addressing that deeply sensitive aspect.
Yeah.
It's an uncomfortable but maybe necessary part of finalizing things.
Right. Okay, moving beyond those immediate swaps, the longer-term goal of this plan is security, total demilitarization, making sure this can't just flare up again. What does it say about Israeli withdrawal and control?
Well, it means more than just defense. It establishes a long-term zone, likely extending, say, a kilometer into Gazan territory, where Israel maintains control indefinitely. It's about preventing tunnels, infiltration, basically ensuring Israeli oversight of the perimeter, no matter who's running things inside.
So not full sovereignty restored to that strip of land.
Not in that zone, no.
And the goal for Gaza itself, Total, permanent demilitarization.
Exactly. Complete demolition of all military infrastructure. Tunnels gone, rocket stockpiles gone, weapons factories gone, and an absolute ban on rebuilding any of it. Gaza must become, in their words, a terror-free zone.
How do they envision enforcing that beyond just demolition?
Well, interestingly, the plan includes a kind of financial incentive, too, an internationally funded buyback program. The idea is to absorb disarmed fighters back into civilian life, offering things like vocational training, maybe small business loans, trying to turn fighters into, well, entrepreneurs, I suppose.
A carrot alongside the stick.
Precisely. Demolish the capacity, but offer individuals a path out.
Okay, now we get to the real political core of this. A demilitarized zone is one thing, but the biggest provision, the one that's causing all the waves, is the absolute exclusion of Hamas permanently.
This is it. The fundamental, non-negotiable point for Trump and Netanyahu, and, well, the immediate deal breaker for Hamas itself, presumably. The plan is crystal clear. Hamas, any affiliated groups, permanently barred. Direct governance, indirect influence, none of it.
It's not just asking them to disarm, it's asking them to dissolve politically.
It is effectively a political dissolution request. They're asking Hamas to agree to its own political irrelevance, its own death, essentially.
Absolutely. Unlikely. But here's where it gets interesting, right? They're asking Hamas to dissolve, but they are offering individual members a way out, this amnesty idea.
It's a very specific carrot and stick. Yes, the stick, you're out of power forever. The
Correct.
carrot aimed at stopping individuals from just going underground and causing trouble later.
So how does the amnesty work?
If Hamas members surrender their weapons, and this is key, formally pledge peaceful coexistence with whatever new authority comes in, they get amnesty. This seems aimed more at the rank and file, giving them a chance to, rejoin society peacefully.
And for those who won't pledge, the leadership, maybe?
For the hardliners, or anyone just unwilling to stay under this new system, the plan offers safe passage out of Gaza. Abroad, with an international guarantee.
Safe passage where?
The sources mention several Arab and European nations are being tentatively lined up to potentially receive them. The message is stark. Disarm and live peacefully here under new management, or disarm and leave, but governing never again.
Okay. So if Hamas is out, who runs Gaza day to day? The plan lays out a specific transitional model.
Yes. Phase 1 is managed by what they call a politically neutral technocratic Palestinian committee. Think non-affiliated experts, administrators. Their job is immediate stuff, getting power back on, food distributed, basic city services running.
Technocrats. But appointed, not elected.
Exactly, and that's the immediate red flag raised in the analysis. Because it's appointed, this body has zero local democratic legitimacy from the start. It's purely functional, a placeholder, really.
Okay, so who holds the real power during this transition? This Board of Peace thing sounds crucial.
It is. This board is positioned as the engine of the whole transition.
Yeah.
It's designed to supervise everything. The technocratic committee, all the reconstruction funding flowing in, enforcing the reforms needed until supposedly a permanent political structure can take over.
And this is the board chaired by Trump, with Tony Blair mentioned too.
Yes, chaired personally by Donald Trump, including international figures like Blair. It's effectively the CEO of the new Gaza, if you like.
Okay, hang on. A board overseeing Palestinian affairs, chaired by the American president who co-authored the plan, who is also running for re-election. I mean, that immediately screams conflict of interest, doesn't it?
It raises massive red flags for analysts, international bodies, you name it. Critics jump on it immediately. Oversight by a board whose chair, well, clearly wasn't chosen by Palestinians, and whose main job seems to be ensuring Israeli security goals are met, it has very strong colonial overtones for many.
Right. It undermines the whole idea of Palestinian self-governance from the get-go.
It absolutely raises serious questions about genuine sovereignty, about impartiality. It makes the board itself a huge point of contention, regardless of how well it might operate on paper.
So this board is temporary. What's the long game for governance?
Well, the board is meant to pave the way for a revitalized Palestinian Authority. The plan actually mandates pretty tough PA reforms and new elections within a year.
Reforms like what?
We're talking deep stuff. Security sector overhaul, serious anti-corruption measures, ensuring democratic leadership selection within the PA itself. The goal is to build up the PA so it can eventually take over functional control, not just in Gaza, but ideally linking back up with the West Bank too.
Okay, and finally, the big picture stuff. The economics, this Marshall Plan for Gaza idea, and the ultimate prize, statehood.
The economic part is the big sweetener, clearly designed to get regional players and the world on board. We're talking huge investment pledges. The sources float names like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE for massive revitalization, jobs, infrastructure funded by a global coalition. The price tag mentioned is in the tens of billions just for the initial phase.
A Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
That's ambitious. Any specifics?
Yeah, the plan talks about setting up a special economic zone, an SEZ, in Gaza. That means things like special tariff rules, easier customs, guaranteed access to global markets. They're targeting sectors like tech, logistics, maybe light manufacturing. The idea is to build, a better Gaza fast, based on economic growth, not just aid dependency.
Sounds good on paper. But the ultimate goal, Palestinian statehood, how solid is that in the plan? It feels...
Oh, absolutely conditional. This is maybe the most conditional point in the whole thing. The plan basically says if the governance reforms work, if security stabilizes, and crucially, stabilizes according to metrics Israel agrees to, and if the demilitarization is total and verified, then conditions could emerge for Palestinian self-determination and maybe statehood, with regional backing.
Lots of ifs and coulds.
Exactly. If could, and that requirement for Israeli sign-off on success, it makes statehood less of a commitment and more of an incentive. A reward for compliance, heavily weighted towards satisfying Israeli security demands first. It's not guaranteed at all.
Okay, something really crucial for you listening to grasp is that this Trump-Netanyahu plan didn't just appear in isolation, did it?
Right.
It was actually one of, 3 major frameworks floated recently. It feels like a global diplomatic scramble over Gaza's future.
That's exactly right. The TN plan entered a very crowded, very high-stakes diplomatic field. It landed shortly after that Saudi-French New York declaration earlier in 2025, and also after the Arab League put forward its own huge reconstruction blueprint. Understanding this context is vital. It shows the TN plan isn't just being presented, it's actively competing for legitimacy against other quite different multilateral options.
Right. Let's look at those alternatives briefly. The Saudi-French New York Declaration, that got a lot of traction, didn't it? EU, Japan, Brazil, Egypt backed it. What was its core idea? How did it differ fundamentally from the U.S.-Israel approach?
The Saudi-French plan really positioned itself as a return to the established international consensus. Its absolute key requirement was demanding an explicit time-bound roadmap, a firm deadline leading to a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as the capital. It was about tangible progress towards sovereignty now.
So focused on the political outcome first.
Exactly. And on security, it called for a UN-mandated stabilization force, ensuring broad international involvement, not just U.S. or Israeli oversight. The biggest difference, the core clash with the TN plan, was in the preconditions.
What precondition?
The New York Declaration explicitly required binding commitments from Israel towards that two-state outcome, and critically, an immediate freeze on settlement activity in the West Bank. Those were the deal breakers for Paris and Riyadh, and those are precisely the things completely missing from the Trump-Netanyahu plan, which puts all the demands on the Palestinian side.
Okay, so that was one major alternative, and the other big one came from the region itself, the Arab League's $53 billion reconstruction plan. $53 billion. That's a staggering number. What was the scope there?
It was a colossal statement of intent from the Arab world, really underscoring their determination to lead the rebuilding. It wasn't just a concept. It was a detailed 112-page plan backed by all 22 Arab states, and it pulled in support from others like China and Italy, too.
And the money was for...
Long-term holistic development. Not just patching things up, but rebuilding infrastructure properly, creating sustainable jobs, reforming education. It was comprehensive.
And their vision for governance.
Their core principle was basically Palestinians governing Palestine. Simple as that. It focused on using a reformed, strengthened Palestinian Authority for self-governance, working with international observers on security, but always aiming for full sovereignty. This directly pushed back against some earlier, more controversial ideas floated by Trump about maybe expelling people or turning Gaza into some kind of controlled resort.
Right. So you had the Saudi-French plan demanding a clear path to two states and the Arab League offering huge money and local leadership. Why didn't one of those win out? Why does the Trump-Netanyahu plan manage to sort of elbow its way to the front?
Well, it really comes down to leverage, diplomatic weight versus on-the-ground power. The Saudi-French plan had broad international backing, sure, but Washington and Tel Aviv hold the immediate keys in the conflict zone itself. They control the weapons flow, the intelligence, the movement of troops, the aid access right now.
Realpolitik, basically.
Pretty much. The TN plan, for all its flaws, offered Israel things the others didn't. guaranteed long-term security dominance, the total exclusion of Hamas, all backed by a personal commitment from the U.S. president.
And regional players like Saudi Arabia.
Well, for countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, even if they preferred the vision of the New York Declaration, they couldn't really afford a complete break with the U.S. over this, especially given their own security needs and relationships with Washington. The TN plan essentially leveraged the immediate crisis, the security vacuum, and America's role as Israel's main backer to force itself onto the table as the primary option, like it or not.
Okay, we see the ambition of the Trump-Netanyahu plan. But ambition, as we know, often papers over some pretty deep cracks. Let's turn now to why so many critics immediately slam this as, well, doomed to fail. Starting with the most basic critique: bias.
Yes, the fundamental structural problem, according to almost every non-aligned observer, is that this plan was drafted with zero Palestinian input. Hamas was obviously excluded, but crucially, even the Palestinian Authority, the very body this plan supposedly wants to empower, eventually they weren't consulted in creating these terms either.
So it feels imposed, not negotiated.
Exactly. That's why you hear critics immediately calling it a blueprint for domination, or even more starkly, a surrender document. The logic is pretty straightforward. It demands total capitulation from one side, disarmament, political exclusion, accepting external control, but offers no binding, unconditional commitments from Israel on the core issues.
Like ending the occupation or settlements?
Precisely. There's no timeline for ending the occupation of the West Bank, no requirement to stop settlement expansion there. It surgically focuses on enforcing changes in Gaza while completely sidestepping the wider political context that fuels the conflict.
Which leads us straight into the internal contradictions. You mentioned earlier that two architects, Trump and Netanyahu, don't even seem to agree on where this is all supposed to end up. What does that do to the plan's coherence?
This is where the political drama really kicks in, and it's a major vulnerability. Look at security control. The plan talks about international forces, the ISF, and eventually the PA taking over security inside Gaza, but Netanyahu, almost immediately after the announcement, put out statements insisting Israel retains indefinite, overriding security authority over Gaza, no matter what the peace deal says.
So who's actually in charge of security long-term? The plan or Netanyahu's interpretation?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a direct conflict. The written plan implies a phased return towards Palestinian control, but the Israeli signatory insists on a permanent Israeli military veto. They can't both be true.
And the statehood issue.
Same problem. Trump, in his statements, kind of hints at this conditional path to statehood, keeping it ambiguous, probably to keep regional partners interested. But Netanyahu, he's on record repeatedly and categorically rejecting any sovereign Palestinian state under any conditions.
How can a plan work if the two main backers fundamentally disagree on the final goal?
It stretches credibility, doesn't it? How do you broker a lasting peace when your key partners have diametrically opposed visions for the political outcome?
And then there's the contradiction we touched on earlier. Amnesty for Hamas members versus Netanyahu's vow to destroy Hamas.
Yes, this is perhaps the sharpest internal conflict. The plan formally offers amnesty and safe passage abroad for Hamas members who disarm. But this flies directly in the face of Netanyahu's core war promise, repeated constantly, to destroy Hamas and bring its leaders to justice.
So for his political base in Israel, offering amnesty is unacceptable.
It's seen as an unconscionable concession by the Israeli right wing, which is key to Netanyahu's coalition. This contradiction makes that amnesty offer look politically hollow, almost insincere, because it seems so unsustainable within Israel itself.
Which leads some observers to a pretty cynical conclusion about Netanyahu's motives.
It does. Many analysts argue, quite plausibly, that Netanyahu might have supported this plan precisely because he calculates, or maybe even hopes, that Hamas will reject it.
Why would he do that?
Because a Hamas rejection gives him exactly what he needs: immediate U.S. backing, diplomatic cover, and the justification to say, see, negotiations are impossible, allowing him to then intensify the military campaign to achieve his own stated goals, crushing Hamas, without having to make those politically toxic concessions on statehood or long-term security control.
So the plan becomes less about peace, more a tool to justify war.
That's the cynical interpretation, yes, framing it as a sophisticated political trap.
Okay, beyond the politics, what about the actual demands on Hamas? Are they even realistic? That 72-hour hostage deadline?
Widely seen as vague and unrealistic. We mentioned the 72-hour deadline. Analysts just don't see how that's logistically feasible in the chaos of Gaza, with communication breakdowns, etc. But more fundamentally, demanding total disarmament and permanent political suicide from Hamas.
It's a non-starter.
It's almost certainly a non-starter. No major armed group in history has just agreed to unilaterally dissolve itself completely in exchange for a conditional amnesty like this. It asks for everything up front.
And the overall framework itself. Critics called it a house of cards.
Yes, because it's built on so many ifs and buts. There's no clear, verifiable timetable for when Israeli forces actually have to leave. The conditions for statehood are deliberately vague and depend entirely on Israeli approval, making them easy to stall indefinitely.
And it's silent on some other huge issues too, right?
Absolutely silent on critical, unresolved flashpoints. Two huge ones. First, what happens in the West Bank? Settlements, occupation, completely ignored. You can't solve Gaza in isolation. Second, the plan says nothing about the future role or even existence of UNRWA.
The UN Relief and Works Agency. That's massive.
It's the main aid provider, employs tens of thousands of Palestinians. For the U.S. and Israel, UNRWA is often seen negatively, as perpetuating the conflict somehow. But just dismantling it without a functioning alternative ready to go, that would trigger an immediate catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Ignoring UNRWA makes the plan look fundamentally incomplete for long-term stability.
Okay, so this brings us right to the sharp end. Given all these flaws, the contradictions, the whole future seems to hang on Hamas's formal response. They were given, what, 3-4 days?
Exactly. The pressure on the Hamas leadership right now must be absolutely immense. They've already voiced deep skepticism, understandably focusing on being totally excluded from power and the lack of any real guarantees on sovereignty. Their decision now is the absolute pivot point. Let's walk through the two main scenarios the analysis lays out. First, the less likely but more hopeful one. Conditional acceptance. They call it the promise.
Okay, if somehow they accept, maybe with conditions,
Yeah.
what happens immediately? Short term.
Immediate relief, on the ground at least. Hostilities would have to pause instantly. The first hostage-prisoner exchanges would begin, maybe not perfectly within 72 hours, but the complex process would start. And crucially, humanitarian aid would surge, flowing much more freely than before. You might even see some displaced civilians start tentative returns to safer zones.
Okay, a pause, aid flows, exchanges start. What about the medium term, the governance piece?
That's when the structures kick in. The Transitional Technocratic Committee takes over daily administration, however shaky its legitimacy might be. And that International Board of Peace, chaired by Trump, starts its oversight role managing reconstruction money, pushing for those early security reforms.
And the regional players, the money.
Critically, if Hamas accepts, countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar would likely start cooperating on that Marshall Plan idea fairly quickly. Seeing capital flow in would add credibility.
And the long-term hope under this scenario.
The hope, however cautious, would be a revival of actual political talks, maybe even dusting off that earlier Saudi-French framework as a basis, given the new cooperation. Gaza could begin a phased reconstruction. Maybe those special economic zones start to create jobs.
But it sounds incredibly fragile. What are the risks, even if they accept?
Oh, the risks are huge. The truce itself would be constantly vulnerable. Spoilers could emerge from anywhere, rogue factions in Gaza, hardliners and the Israeli government looking to scuttle it. And because Hamas is politically excluded, even if they accept the deal now, they could easily go underground and rebrand as a resistance movement against the Board of Peace.
And instability in Israel, too.
Absolutely. Any concession, even temporary ones required by this deal, would likely fracture Netanyahu's far-right coalition. So acceptance creates its own set of deep instabilities.
Okay. Now let's turn to the scenario most analysts seem to think is far more probable and certainly more perilous. Formal rejection by Hamas.
Right. If Hamas formally says no and they'd frame it not as rejecting peace but rejecting a surrender document, they'll likely reiterate demands for a permanent ceasefire first and real sovereignty talks. The diplomatic fallout from Washington would be swift and harsh.
What does Trump do?
Trump immediately condemns Hamas, paints them as unreasonable terrorists choosing death over peace. And crucially, he makes good on his promise. Full U.S. backing for Israel to finish the job.
Yeah.
Meaning expedited weapons shipments, more intelligence sharing, and vital diplomatic cover for Israel, especially at the UN Security Council, blocking any critical resolutions. Netanyahu then uses that rejection as final proof. We tried diplomacy, they refused. Now we must act. It greenlights his preferred military strategy.
And what does that short-term military escalation look like, say, in the first month after rejection?
A significant acceleration of Israel's offensive. Expect expanded airstrikes, ground forces pushing deeper into dense urban areas like Gaza City, a renewed focus on tunnels and leadership targets. Hamas, in return, would likely unleash renewed rocket attacks and dig in for intense urban guerrilla warfare, ambushes.
And the humanitarian situation.
Catastrophic. If the deal collapses, the aid mechanisms negotiated under it collapse too. Aid stalls completely. The risk of famine, disease outbreaks skyrockets. Civilian casualties would likely climb dramatically, leading to intense international pressure, maybe even formal ICC investigations becoming more likely.
Beyond Gaza itself, what if the region? Medium-term ripple effects, say, over 6 months.
This is the nightmare scenario for regional stability. Rejection could easily embolden Hezbollah in Lebanon, maybe other Iranian-linked groups in Syria or Iraq. They might significantly ramp up cross-border attacks on Israel's north.
And Israel's response.
With full U.S. backing now confirmed, Israel would likely retaliate much more forcefully than before, potentially hitting targets linked to Iran further afield, risking a much wider escalation.
What about the Arab states? The reconstruction plans?
The $53 billion Arab League plan, dead in the water. Gulf states won't pour money into rebuilding a territory that's effectively an active war zone under indefinite Israeli security control. In countries like Egypt and Jordan, they'd face huge internal pressure. Fearing instability or refugee flows, they'd likely tighten their borders even further, trapping civilians in an even more desperate situation inside Gaza.
So the long-term outlook if Hamas rejects is grim.
Extremely grim. The conflict essentially becomes frozen in a state of active, grinding hostility. Israel might degrade Hamas's military capacity over time through sheer attrition, but likely wouldn't eradicate it entirely. You'd probably see a persistent, hardened guerrilla resistance underground. The economic vision. Gone. Gaza risks being reduced to a devastated, tightly controlled security zone managed by Israel and not a rebuilt society. And any hope for a two-state solution. Pushed even further away, maybe indefinitely. #tag outro.
Okay, let's try and pull this together. This deep dive really shows the Trump-Netanyahu plan is, well, it's maximalist, it's built on shaky foundations, and it's incredibly conditional, isn't it?
It is. It clearly aims to deliver total security for Israel and maybe provide some useful diplomatic cover for the U.S., especially in an election year. But it seems fundamentally undermined by the fact that Palestinians had no real say in it and by the clashing long-term goals of Trump and Netanyahu themselves.
It feels like it highlights that classic, maybe impossible balancing act in the Middle East.
Absolutely. It underscores that persistent challenge.
Yeah.
You have to somehow balance Israel's legitimate, undeniable security needs with the Palestinians' legitimate rights to self-determination and sovereignty, and you need international mediators who are seen as credible and impartial by both sides.
And if one of those legs gets kicked out,
the whole thing collapses. If security overrides rights, or if mediation isn't trusted, or if rights ignore security, it just doesn't work. Stability requires all three.
And the sheer number of plans lately. Trump-Netanyahu, Saudi-French, Arab League, all in 2025, shows the urgency, but maybe also the fragmentation of effort.
It shows everyone recognizes the urgency, yes, but also the deep disagreement on the pathway forward. However, I think the most critical point that came out of our analysis today is maybe the underlying motivation behind this specific plan.
You mean the possibility that Netanyahu backed it, expecting rejection?
Yes. We have to leave you with this uncomfortable thought. When a major peace plan is actively pushed by one side's leader, perhaps primarily because they believe the other side will inevitably reject it, does that plan genuinely function as diplomacy? Is it really aimed at finding a negotiated peace?
Or is it something else?
Or does it function more as a calculated political maneuver? A tool designed to provide the necessary moral justification, the diplomatic cover, for escalating military action and prolonging the conflict on their own terms? That's the really stark question, the uncomfortable truth perhaps, that you need to consider as you weigh the promise and the profound peril embedded in this Trump-Netanyahu framework.